Every 2 weeks, a research boat motors out to the deepest point of Lake Tahoe, and a scientist lowers a white disc 10 inches across into the water on the end of a rope. The disc sinks through blue that has no comparison in North America. Not the ocean, not the Great Lakes, not any glacier-fed pool in Alaska. The scientist watches it descend, growing smaller and dimmer until the moment it vanishes. Then she marks the depth on a clipboard. In 1968, the first year anyone did this, the disk disappeared at 102 feet. That number has never been reached again. Lake Tahoe holds roughly 40 trillion gallons of water. It is 22 miles long, 12 miles wide, and in places more than 1,600 feet deep, deep enough to submerge the Empire State Building with 100 feet to spare. It sits at 6,225 feet above sea level in the Sierra Nevada, straddling the border of California and Nevada. And on a still winter morning, the water is so transparent it seems like a hallucination. Rocks on the bottom appear close enough to touch from the surface. A boat looks like it's hovering in midair. For 10,000 years, this was among the clearest bodies of fresh water on Earth. Today, 15 million people visit Lake Tahoe every year. That's 3 times the annual visitation of Yosemite National Park, crammed into a basin 1/3 Yosemite's size. The region supports a $5 billion tourism economy. More than $3 billion in public and private money has been spent over the past quarter century on more than 800 projects designed to protect and restore the lake. And the white disk? In 2024, it vanished at 62 feet. 40 feet of visibility, gone. The lake that everyone comes to see, the one on the postcards, the one Mark Twain called the fairest picture the whole earth affords, is slowly, measurably, disappearing into itself. The Washoe tribe knew the lake for at least 10,000 years before any European saw it. They called it Da'o-Aga, which translates roughly to edge of the lake, and they considered it the sacred center of their world. Every summer, Washoe families migrated up from the Carson Valley to camp along its shores, fishing for Lahontan cutthroat trout and gathering pine nuts in the surrounding forests. The lake was not a destination for the Washoe. It was the reason everything else existed. When the first white explorers arrived, Lieutenant John C. Fremont, on Valentine's Day, 1844, catching a glimpse of the water from a high ridge, they mispronounced the first 2 syllables of Da'o-Aga, and eventually the garbled version stuck. The lake was briefly named after a California governor, Lake Bigler, but by 1945, Tahoe was official. The Washoe never left. They're still there, still fighting to recover fragments of land that was entirely theirs within living memory of their grandparents' grandparents. For about 15 years after Fremont's sighting, almost nobody bothered with the place. It was too high, too cold, too far from anything. Then, in 1859, something happened 24 miles to the east that would change the lake forever, and the event had nothing to do with water. A prospector named Henry Comstock put his name on the richest silver deposit ever found in the United States, buried under the slopes of Mount Davidson near Virginia City, Nevada. The Comstock lode turned Virginia City into a boom town of 20,000 people almost overnight. And those 20,000 people needed one thing above all else: wood. Wood for mine shafts, wood for railroad ties, wood for buildings, for fuel, for charcoal. The ancient forests ringing Lake Tahoe, towering sugar pines, Douglas fir, white fir, were the nearest supply. What followed was an industrial harvest of staggering efficiency. Timber companies set up sawmills on the lakeshore, floated logs across the water, and ran them through flumes that snaked down the eastern slope to Carson City and the mines beyond. The Carson and Tahoe Lumber and Fluming Company, operating out of Glenbrook on the lake's eastern shore, transferred an estimated 750 million board feet of lumber between 1872 and 1898, cut from 80,000 acres of virgin timberland. By the time the silver began to run out, roughly 80% of the forests in the Tahoe Basin had been clear-cut. The mountains that Fremont had seen draped in dark, unbroken green were stripped to bare rock and stumps. One journalist in Virginia City estimated that the Comstock load had consumed every tree on the eastern slope of the Sierra Nevada for 50 to 60 miles in every direction. The forests eventually grew back, but the second-growth timber that replaced the old stands was denser, less fire-resistant, and fundamentally different in character. The scars of that era are still visible in the structure of the woods today. Something else happened during the Comstock years that planted a seed. As miners and their families flooded Virginia City, some of them started making the short trip over the mountains to see the lake. Tahoe City was founded in 1864 as a resort community, a place where people who had gotten rich off silver could relax, gamble a little, and enjoy the water. It was, in a quiet way, the first time Lake Tahoe was treated as a product, something to be consumed rather than lived in. The Washoe were still there, but they were being pushed to the margins of a place that had been exclusively theirs for 100 centuries. In 1861, a 25-year-old named Samuel Clemens, not yet Mark Twain, hiked from Carson City to the lake's north shore with a friend named John Kinney, hoping to stake a timber claim and become a lumber baron. The plan lasted about a week. Clemens was enchanted by the lake itself. He would later write that the water was so clear a boat seemed to float in the air, with every pebble and trout visible 80 feet below. But he was a terrible frontiersman. One evening he let a cooking fire get away from him. The flames raced into the surrounding brush, and Clemens and Kinney barely escaped into the lake in a borrowed skiff. The timber claim burned with it. Clemens gave up on lumber, drifted into journalism, became Mark Twain, and 11 years later turned the whole embarrassing episode into chapters of Roughing It. His descriptions of the lake's impossible clarity became some of the most famous nature writing in American literature. The clarity he described, the sensation of a boat suspended in crystalline air above a perfectly visible bottom, was real. That was what the lake actually looked like before anyone started measuring. After the Comstock faded in the late 1870s, the timber barons moved on and the basin entered a new phase. The cutover land had no obvious commercial value, but the lake itself, the spectacle of it, the mountain air, the summer weather, was beginning to attract a different kind of money. With the completion of the Transcontinental Railroad through nearby Donner Pass in 1869, wealthy families from San Francisco and Sacramento could reach the lake in a day. The South Shore became the first playground. In 1880, an entrepreneur named Elias Lucky Baldwin, already famous in California for his real estate gambles and racehorses, acquired the Talek Point House and transformed it into a luxurious resort that also happened to be Lake Tahoe's first casino. Baldwin built a hotel complex that could accommodate over 250 guests, with a ballroom, a string orchestra, croquet and tennis courts, an opulent lakeside promenade, and steamer rides. The resort drew San Francisco's elite, and before long, the South Shore was dotted with private estates. The Talek Historic Site, 74 acres of those old grounds, is still there. You can walk through the summer homes and gardens today, preserved almost exactly as they appeared in the early 1900s. On the North Shore, the scene was similar. In 1901, Walter Danforth Bliss, his family had made a fortune in the same timber industry that had stripped the basin, built the Tahoe Tavern in Tahoe City, a grand resort that drew visitors arriving by train to Truckee and then by steamship across the lake. Guests stepped off the narrow-gauge railway, walked to the pier, and boarded steamers that crossed to the South Shore and back in a single afternoon, the mountains reflected in water so still it looked like blown glass. The Glenbrook Inn on the east shore, Brockway Springs on the north, the Talac and its neighbors on the south, together they formed a circuit of lakeside luxury that rivaled anything in the Adirondacks or the Catskills, except the setting was a mile higher and the water was bluer. The irony of timber fortunes funding a leisure economy on land the timber business had devastated was invisible at the time, or at least unspoken. The Gilded Age pattern was simple: extract, destroy, then build a resort on what's left and charge people to look at it. Then came the man who did something no one expected, and whose decision shaped more of what Tahoe looks like today than any government regulation or environmental law. George Whittell, Jr. was born in San Francisco in 1881, the son of the founder of Pacific Gas and Electric. He inherited $29 million when his father died in 1922, invested it in the stock market, and watched it grow to $50 million. In the fall of 1929, just weeks before the crash that would wipe out fortunes across the country, Whittell liquidated every stock he owned. He walked away with $50 million in cash, the equivalent of roughly $4 billion today, and moved to Nevada to avoid California's income and real estate taxes. He called himself the Captain, though he had no military career that justified the title. He kept exotic pets, including a lion and a small elephant. He ran away to join the circus as a young man. He drove an ambulance in World War I. He once said, reportedly without irony, that when men stop boozing, womanizing, and gambling, the bloom is off the rose. In 1935, Whittell did something that would have seemed insane if anyone else had done it, and seemed merely eccentric because he had the money to absorb the consequences. He purchased nearly the entire Nevada shoreline of Lake Tahoe, 40,000 acres, stretching 27 miles from Crystal Bay to Zephyr Cove. The land was mostly deforested, the aftermath of the Comstock era, and nobody wanted it. He paid about $6 an acre for the shoreline parcels and $3 an acre for the highland tracts. Total cost? Roughly $2.3 million. He now owned 95% of everything on the Nevada side of the lake. Whittell had plans. He drew up designs for a casino at Sand Harbor, another at Zephyr Cove, a luxury hotel, possibly a ski resort. He was going to develop the Nevada shore the way Baldwin had developed the South Shore, but bigger, grander, and with gambling as the engine. Instead, he built one house. The Thunderbird Lodge, designed by prominent Reno architect Frederick de Longchamp, was completed in 1938, a stone mansion at the water's edge with a 600-foot tunnel connecting the main house to a boathouse where Whittell kept a 55-foot mahogany yacht he also called Thunderbird. The tunnel was reportedly built so he could move between the house and the boat without being seen. There were more than 20 rooms in the main lodge, a lighthouse, guest cottages, and enough seclusion that Whittell could live exactly the way he wanted, which turned out to be alone, with his animals, on the shore of the most beautiful lake he had ever seen. Something changed in Whittell. The man who had bought 27 miles of shoreline to build casinos gradually became the man who refused to let anyone else build anything at all. He fell in love with the land, its beauty, its silence, the way the light hit the water at different hours. He stopped entertaining development proposals. He turned down buyers. When the state of Nevada grew frustrated that one man controlled so much of its most valuable real estate, officials used eminent domain to seize Sand Harbor and turn it into a state park. In 1960, Whittell was pressured into selling 9,000 acres to developers who would create the planned community of Incline Village. He sold additional parcels under duress over the years that followed. But he never built the casinos. He never built the hotel. He held most of the land until his death on April 18, 1969, by which time his fortune, his stubbornness, and what you might generously call his antisocial personality had accidentally preserved more of Lake Tahoe's natural shoreline than any conservation group in the basin's history. The year Whittell died, 1969, was also the year scientists at UC Davis began measuring the lake's clarity with that white disk, the Secchi disk, establishing the longest unbroken clarity record for any lake in the world. It was also the year California and Nevada, alarmed by the pace of construction around the lake, formed the Tahoe Regional Planning Agency to try to manage development on both sides of the state line. Whittell had been doing that job by himself for free for 30 years. Now the government would need bureaucracies, lawsuits, compacts, and billions of dollars to attempt what one stubborn millionaire had accomplished by simply refusing to return anyone's phone calls. While Whittell was hoarding his shoreline, the rest of the lake was becoming something else entirely. The casinos arrived in earnest on the Nevada side in the 1940s. The Cal-Neva Lodge, built in 1926 on a plot of land that literally straddled the California-Nevada border — the state line ran through the swimming pool and down the middle of the dining room — became the most famous of them all, though its peak wouldn't come for another 3 decades. By the 1930s, Hollywood celebrities like Clara Bow were already showing up. Bow reportedly ran up a $13,000 blackjack debt at the Cal-Neva in 1930 and then refused to pay, claiming she'd mistaken the $100 chips for 50-cent pieces. The resulting scandal was national news. The Cal-Neva changed hands several times, each owner adding to the legend. But the owner who mattered, the one who launched Tahoe into a different orbit, was Frank Sinatra. In 1960, Sinatra purchased the lodge and brought the Rat Pack with him. Dean Martin was a co-investor. Sammy Davis Jr. performed in the Celebrity Room. Marilyn Monroe visited the private cottages. The Cal-Neva became a nexus of mid-century American glamour, the place where Hollywood, Las Vegas, and the mountains converged. Sinatra expanded the lodge from 55 rooms to 220. He reportedly repurposed Prohibition-era smuggling tunnels beneath the property to allow certain guests to move unseen. The guest who caused the trouble was Sam Giancana, a Chicago mob boss who had been placed on Nevada's notorious Black Book, a list of people banned from entering any casino in the state. In the summer of 1963, the Nevada Gaming Control Board learned that Giancana was staying in one of the Cal-Neva's private cottages as Sinatra's personal guest. The board challenged Sinatra to explain himself. Sinatra responded with threats. He told Ed Olson, the head of the Gaming Commission, to try to find him with a subpoena. He promised a big, fat surprise. The bluster didn't work. In October 1963, Sinatra surrendered his Nevada gaming licenses rather than face revocation. He walked away from the Cal-Neva, and with him went an era. The lodge limped along under different owners for decades, its revenue dropping to roughly half of its 1992 peak by 2009. It finally ceased operations in March 2010. Several other Tahoe area casinos closed around the same time. A Napa-based developer purchased the property in 2013, intending to spend nearly $50 million on a full restoration. The project stalled. The Cal-Neva sits shuttered today, the state line still painted on the bottom of the empty pool. But before the Cal-Neva faded, before the casinos began their decline, something happened in February 1960 that changed the basin more than Sinatra or Giancana or any amount of gambling revenue ever could. The Winter Olympics came to Squaw Valley. The story behind it was improbable to the point of absurdity. Alexander Cushing, a Harvard-educated lawyer turned ski resort owner, had a single chairlift, 2 rope tows, a 50-room lodge, and a dirt road. That was the entirety of Squaw Valley in the mid-1950s. Cushing read a newspaper article about the competition to host the 1960 Winter Games and decided his undeveloped valley should be in the running. He was competing against Innsbruck, Austria, a city with centuries of winter sports infrastructure. When the International Olympic Committee voted in 1956, Squaw Valley won by 2 votes, 32-30. The world was shocked. Walt Disney was brought in to choreograph the opening and closing ceremonies. By February 1960, $80 million had been spent transforming the valley. An 8,500-seat ice arena, a speed skating oval, 4 athlete dormitories, a complete underground sewage system, an electrical grid, a water system, an entire city built from nothing. Vice President Richard Nixon opened the games on February 18th. CBS purchased exclusive rights to televise the event, the first time a network had done so for any Winter Olympics, and in the process invented the instant replay, when officials asked the network to check whether a skier had missed a gate. 666 athletes from 30 nations competed over 11 days. The images beamed into living rooms across America showed something irresistible. Snow-covered peaks, blue sky, and glittering in the background, the vast cobalt surface of Lake Tahoe. The development boom that followed the Olympics dwarfed anything the basin had seen before. The completion of the 4-lane Interstate 80 slashed travel time from Sacramento to under 2 hours. Highway 50, upgraded from the old Bonanza Road that had first been carved for Comstock-era freight, brought traffic directly to the South Shore. Motels, condominiums, restaurants, gas stations, and shopping centers filled the gaps between the older resort communities. In the 2 decades after 1960, the number of permanent residents around the lake increased by 10,000, and summer visitation climbed to 90,000 annually, numbers that would, in retrospect, seem almost quaint. Ski resorts multiplied: Heavenly, North Star, Alpine Meadows, Sierra at Tahoe, Diamond Peak, joining the older Sugar Bowl, which had opened in 1938, with Walt Disney among its founding investors. The basin was being converted, acre by acre, from forest and meadow into a year-round recreation economy. And every new road, every new parking lot, every new roof and gutter sent fine sediment and nutrients washing into the lake during rainstorms and snowmelt. The Tahoe Regional Planning Agency, formed in 1969 as part of a unique bi-state compact between California and Nevada, was supposed to be the check on all of this. Its mission was to balance development with environmental protection, to let the economy grow without killing the lake. The tension between those two goals has defined Tahoe politics ever since, and it has never been resolved. Environmentalists have called TRPA too permissive. Developers have called it too restrictive. Residents have called it both, sometimes in the same sentence. At an August 2024 hearing of the Nevada Legislature's Lake Tahoe Oversight Committee, residents lined up to chastise the agency and the lawmakers they said were complicit. One woman bowed her head and asked for a moment of silence for Lake Tahoe. There was a brief pause. Then the next speaker came to the podium. The science, meanwhile, has been telling its own story with cold precision. UC Davis researchers began measuring the lake's clarity in 1968, and for the next 30 years the trend was relentless. The Secchi disk vanished at shallower and shallower depths, declining at a rate of about 9 inches per year. From 102 feet in 1968, clarity fell to a record low of 64 feet in 1997. The culprits were fine sediment particles from urban runoff, nitrogen and phosphorus from development, and atmospheric deposition, the accumulation of pollutants drifting in from as far away as the Central Valley. Every new driveway, every new ski run, every new stretch of impervious surface added a tiny increment of particulate matter to the system. Individually, none of it looked like much. Collectively, it was blinding the lake. Around 2000, the decline in annual clarity stabilized. It stopped getting worse. Scientists considered this a significant achievement, the result of decades of regulation, erosion control, and the decision in the 1970s to export all treated sewage out of the basin rather than releasing it into the watershed. But the clarity didn't come back either. It just hovered, 65 feet, 70 feet, 68 feet, year after year, decade after decade. The 5-year running average as of 2023 was 65 feet, still 19% below the interim target of 78 feet that regulators had set for 2026. The long-term goal, to restore the lake to its historic clarity of 97.4 feet, the average from 1967 to 1971, is not expected to be reached until 2081. No one alive today who remembers what the lake looked like at its clearest is likely to see it that way again. Then the pandemic arrived, and everything accelerated. When COVID-19 shut down offices across the Bay Area and Sacramento in the spring of 2020, thousands of remote workers did the math and reached the same conclusion. If you don't have to be in the city, why not live at the lake? Home prices in the Tahoe Basin, already high, tripled between 2012 and 2021. By 2024, the median sale price across the region reached $980,000. Vacation rentals exploded. At one point, an estimated 56% of housing units in the El Dorado County portion of the basin were owned by absentees, second home owners or investors renting on Airbnb and Vrbo. Only 21% of Tahoe residents could afford the median home price. Half the regional workforce began commuting in from Truckee, Carson City, or Reno, driving mountain roads for an hour or more each way to serve food, clean hotel rooms, and run ski lifts in a place where they could no longer afford to sleep. In 2018, voters in South Lake Tahoe passed Measure T, banning vacation rentals in residential neighborhoods, a signal of how desperate locals had become for relief. 1,400 property owners with active vacation rental permits were told their permits would be phased out over 3 years. The city estimated it could lose up to $4 million a year in tax revenue. A pizza shop owner predicted the homes would just sit empty. A resident who had supported the measure was less concerned. There may be large parties of 30 or 40 people that want to rent a mega mansion and throw a bacchanalia, he said, and that's not going to happen anymore. The summer after the pandemic lockdowns lifted was the one that broke the pattern. Vacation-starved visitors poured into the basin, packing beaches that had no capacity for the crowds, clogging the 2-lane highways that rim the lake with traffic jams that could stretch for hours, and leaving behind a volume of trash that stunned even the people who had been cleaning up after tourists for decades. On July 5, 2023, the day after Independence Day, the League to Save Lake Tahoe collected more than 8,000 pounds of garbage during a single beach cleanup. That was more than double the amount from the same cleanup in 2022. In November 2022, Fodor's Travel, the venerable guidebook publisher, placed Lake Tahoe on its annual No List, a roster of places it recommended tourists avoid for the good of the destination itself. The diagnosis was blunt. Lake Tahoe has a people problem. The designation stung. Tourism officials were publicly miffed. The South Lake Tahoe mayor pushed back, insisting the region was taking steps to manage the situation. But behind the defensiveness, the numbers were hard to argue with. 15 million annual visitors, traffic jams that could stretch back to Sacramento, beaches so crowded that a woman named Susan Daniels, 70, a lifelong resident of Kings Beach whose parents had met at a Tahoe ski resort in 1952, told reporters she couldn't visit her favorite beach at Sand Harbor, the one where she'd grown up, unless she got in line at 7 in the morning. And then came the fires. On August 14, 2021, the Caldor fire ignited in the Sierra foothills. It burned for weeks, marching east toward the Tahoe Basin with 100-foot flames racing through tree canopies. By August 30th, the fire had crossed Highway 50 and entered the basin itself. The entire city of South Lake Tahoe, 22,000 residents, was placed under mandatory evacuation. The traffic was apocalyptic, cars loaded with bikes and camping gear, some hauling boats, crawling through air thick with brown smoke on a highway designed for summer tourists, not a mass exodus. The Caldor fire ultimately burned more than 221,000 acres and destroyed 782 structures. It was the second wildfire in California history to burn from one side of the Sierra Nevada to the other. Firefighters managed to hold the line before the flames reached the city's core, but the image, South Lake Tahoe, the playground of the West, empty and smoked out, its residents sleeping on Red Cross cots in a gymnasium in Gardnerville, Nevada, was a new kind of postcard. The fires were not an accident of weather. They were in part a consequence of the same logging that had stripped the basin 160 years earlier. The second growth forests that replaced the old growth were denser, more trees per acre, more ladder fuels connecting the forest floor to the canopy, more material to burn. Climate change was drying those forests out, extending fire seasons, and making extreme fire behavior more common. The Tahoe Basin had been managing its forest fuels for decades, prescribed burns, mechanical thinning. But the scale of the problem outpaced the response. The Cal-Neva fire was a reminder that the forces threatening the lake were no longer limited to runoff and construction. The entire landscape was becoming more volatile. In July 2023, a study published in Nature delivered another blow. Researchers sampling microplastics in 38 freshwater lakes around the world found that Lake Tahoe, the lake known globally for its purity, the lake protected by more laws and agencies and dollars than perhaps any other body of fresh water in America, had the third highest concentration of microplastics of any lake tested, higher than ocean garbage gyres. Tiny fragments of clothing fibers, packaging, plastic trash, the residue of 15 million annual visitors, their sunscreen bottles and sandwich bags and synthetic fleece jackets had infiltrated the water column. Divers surveying a small section of the lake bed counted 673 plastic items. The microplastics are too small to see with the naked eye, but they are part of what the Secchi disk is measuring. They are part of why the water is cloudier. They are, in a sense, the visitors themselves, dissolved into particles and suspended in the thing they came to admire. More than $3 billion has been spent on restoration and improvement projects around Lake Tahoe since the late 1990s. Congress recently reauthorized the Lake Tahoe Restoration Act, allocating another $300 million over the next 10 years. The work planned for the next 5 years alone is estimated to cost more than $2 billion. But a Cal Matters investigation in 2025 found that the spending has increasingly shifted away from direct environmental restoration and toward recreation and tourism infrastructure. About $581 million, more than a third of all government and private money spent in the Tahoe region since 2010, has funded recreation, transit, paved paths, and trail projects, including a $40 million sports and aquatic center. Since 2015, those expenditures have accounted for 43% of all funding, double the share from the previous 5 years. One federal grant of $24 million was awarded to add 1.75 miles to a bike trail. The planners say the trails reduce car trips and therefore reduce pollutant runoff. The critics say the trails bring more tourists, who bring more cars, who bring more particulates, who bring more trash, who bring more microplastics. The argument circles the lake like a road with no exit. The Tahoe Regional Planning Agency, the body that was created in 1969 to protect the lake from overdevelopment, has in recent years pivoted toward what it calls economic development. Tourism now accounts for more than 60% of the basin's $5 billion economy, up from 40% in 2010. The agency that was built to say no has found it increasingly difficult to say no to an economy that depends on yes. Housing for workers, the people who serve the drinks and clean the condos and patrol the beaches, remains in crisis. 44% of all housing units in the basin are vacant on a seasonal basis, sitting empty while the people who keep the place running drive in from an hour away. The median home price requires a household income of roughly 245% of the area median income. A balanced housing market would mean 50% of households could afford the median-priced home. In the Tahoe Basin, that number is 21%. On the east shore, the Whittell shore, the preserved shore, it's 10. There is a version of this story where George Whittell is the hero. A man with no altruistic impulses, no environmental convictions, no interest in posterity, who nonetheless saved 27 miles of shoreline simply because he loved it and didn't want to share. His land, the land he was forced, piece by piece, to surrender, is today the least developed portion of the lake, the stretch where the trees come down to the water and the sky is uninterrupted by roof lines and power lines and the glow of casino signs. The Thunderbird Lodge is a museum now, open for tours 5 days a week from May through October. Visitors can walk through the 20-plus rooms and the 600-foot tunnel and look at the 55-foot mahogany yacht and hear about the man who kept a pet lion in the Sierra Nevada. Outside the lodge, the water is the same blue it was in 1938 when the house was finished. But it is not as clear. It has not been that clear since before the Olympics, before the freeways, before the second home boom, before the pandemic migration, before the microplastics. Every 2 weeks, the boat goes out. The scientist lowers the disk. In 2025, the annual average clarity was 69.2 feet, 7 feet better than the year before, but not statistically different from recent years, and still nearly 30 feet less than what Mark Twain saw when his campfire got away from him, and he dove into water so transparent the bottom looked like it was right there. The disk drops through the blue, growing smaller, losing definition, passing through a column of water that contains, invisibly, the residue of everything that has been done to this place and everything that has been loved about it. At 69 feet, the white circle dissolves into nothing. The scientist notes the depth and reels the rope back in. The lake, which has been here for 2 million years, holds 40 trillion gallons of water and swallows the measurement whole.